Hey, you, come over here right now. Did that feel like I was getting in your face? You're right, I was. I want you to have a think about it. Why do you find conflict confronting? Is it because when you have conflict with people, you have a fear of rejection or alienation? Is it a worry that if you confront someone, it might have negative consequences such as, retaliation, punishment, or even criticism? Do you dislike venting so many strong feelings such as anger, frustration, and sadness? Or does it concern you that when you're in disagreement with people, you might not be able to articulate what you want without escalating things dramatically and it all just getting out of control? There are many factors that result in us being scared of clashes with others and allowing conflict to take place. Let's face it, it's really scary for most of us. So let's have a go at reframing conflict today and looking at it as an opportunity for growth and resolution rather than a threat. I'm Kate Mason and welcome to Parenting and Personalities. This is the podcast that connects you with the ones you care about the most. Join me today as we explore effective tactics for addressing conflict in the workplace, which are also applicable for various situations, including your family dynamics. As you and I know, conflict is a common aspect of both professional and personal relationships, and while it might seem unavoidable, there are practical approaches to navigate and resolve it constructively. My guest today is Kate Russell. Kate has worked for many years in the industry of mediation and conflict resolution and helps people unravel workplace conflict through team and leadership development. She works with leaders and teams to build high levels of trust, communicate effectively, and reduce stress, both personal and team stress, to create safe and dynamic workplaces. She uses her mediation skills and deep understanding of people's different communication and behavioural styles to assist leaders and teams to have more empathy for each other so that they're better equipped to manage the day-to-day stresses of their industry. Kate's business, The Huddle, takes a holistic and strengths-based approach to reducing team and individual stress and maximising outcomes by creating programs that specifically meet the needs of your team. Good morning, Kate.
Good morning, Kate.
It's lovely to have you on the show today. What we're going to do is you and I are going to talk about conflict, and we realise that conflict is something that everybody hates to talk about and hates to be in.
Absolutely. Indeed.
So
and yet we are there all the time.
Yes, we are. It's a constant in our lives. So can you tell me where you began with conflict in your life, your early years?
Well, look, I mean, it started in my home life, early years. Realistically, I had parents who loved each other dearly and fought endlessly, and there was high levels of conflict. And so I grew up around conflict, and it was scary. I mean, loud conflict is very scary, but it's really interesting because it's been a significant part of my entire life. But I think that the reason for it is that it's been obvious from day one that conflict is about people not listening to each other. Then they're so stressed, they're in themselves in that moment, in their heads or wherever, but they find it difficult to actually share vulnerably what's going on for them. And so they can say and do behaviours which really harm, and intended to cause harm because they're hurting so much. But I just always knew if you could just slow down and have a conversation, if we could just stop the reaction, we'd get better outcomes. So I did start, it really did start in my home life, and it was pretty full on at times. But I didn't want to live in that world of total conflict. It's constant. It was toxic conflict. So.
And did it wear your parents down?
Oh, it did. And they eventually separated, but they were a very interesting couple because they stayed together for a lot longer than they probably should have. And I think they did truly love each other, but they just couldn't live together at all. So, yeah.
And a lot of people do stay together because they know no different.
That's exactly right.
They're engaged in that every day of conflict, and there's nothing different, and there's no changes. And like we say, if nothing changes, does it? You
No.
just go on.
And sometimes it feels really safe to be in a space where you know what's going to happen, even if you don't like it.
Yeah. So as a child of parents that are in that type of conflict and you come out of that, did you kind of resolve that you wouldn't have conflict in your life, or did you find that there was more conflict in your life and you just didn't want to deal with any of it? What?
I think it's really interesting. I don't know if I went, if I intentionally ended up here. Like, I think it's like lots of things. You just find yourself in certain places. But what happened was that I went to university. I left home halfway through year 12. I got into university. I supported myself through all of that, and I wanted to study psychology, and that didn't work out because I can't do maths. So I couldn't pass statistics. So all right, and I ended up studying politics, which is really interesting because it is all about conflict. And I loved that because I'm just intrigued by the behaviours that people have, but also how do we look after each other. And then I ended up by accident, because my cousin was working there at the Parks Legal Service, which was a community legal centre, and I was the secretary there. And eventually I found myself into legal practices. So I then went and worked in another legal practice as an admin support person. And after that, I was employed as the manager of the Parks Legal Service. And I was 26 years old. I wasn't very old. And I'm surrounded by lots of conflict because it's law. But what was really obvious, I'm the non-lawyer in this legal practice, but what's really obvious is that people want to be able to tell their story and they want to be seen and heard and appreciated. And that doesn't always need to look like conflict, and it doesn't need to look like legal process or whatever. And so that really started my whole career down a path of how do we get better outcomes for people? How do we give people a voice who don't have a voice? How do we hear each other? And it's been really powerful. And the clients that we had at the parks were just extraordinary. I mean, it was a socioeconomic poverty area. So we had a lot of people on Centrelink payments. We had a lot of, at that time in the 80s, Vietnamese refugees, Cambodian refugees. We worked very closely with those communities. And it was, how do we give these people a voice? And I ended up representing a lot of these people at the Social Security Appeals Tribunal because there were issues to do with their Centrelink payments. And then that sort of spurred on other things that I ended up doing. So conflict's been an extraordinary experience for me, but it's so much, it's not about the conflict, it's about the conversation. It's about the conversation that we're not having. And what if we had those conversations instead of having the emotional reaction to everything that comes along? But I do know, having worked at the parks and worked and having a daughter with a disability and worked with people who are struggling, that the more stressed we are, then the more likely we are going to be to engage in more toxic conflict because we're going to react, because we're defensive, because we're hurting. And so how do we calm that all down so that we can think and listen and ask good questions and do all of that?
So did you need any training to go into all of this? Because this is really heavy work. This is, because let's face it, the stressed people that you're dealing with are more likely to be conflicting and angry, and you have to calm that down. I think that's the thing that most of us are. It's all very well to know that and understand that we have to listen to someone, but to engage with somebody as well, their stress, you have to de-stress possibly the other person that you're talking to.
Look, I think I learned a lot on the job, and I didn't have any formal training, but I had done a lot of therapy in response to my early years. So I had done a lot of therapy, and intuitively I knew that listening to people was an incredibly effective tool for helping people de-stress in the moment. And so I used that a lot, and I ended up becoming a mediator. So I ended up training as a mediator, but that was much later. Once I recognised that was really the space that I wanted to go in, and to this very day, I'm still a mediator, but I'd have to say that I don't actually mediate a lot, not in the formal way, but I use those tools to help workplaces reduce conflict all the time.
Okay, so what defines a mediator? Like, what is the actual role of a mediator?
The role of the mediator is to help the parties hear each other so that they can then work out what action they're going to take to resolve whatever the issue is. So it's not to go in there and fix anything. It doesn't. You don't always get a resolution because the parties are not always in a position to be able to do that. And it's the role of the mediator is really to assist the parties to listen to each other, to talk to each other, but to help them to see the other party, to help them to explore what's really going on here. And if you go really formal, it's about what's the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, and so what can you live with, and all of those things. But I use it very much more about facilitated conversations around how can we hear each other better, and the work that you do in pre-mediation. So before you get the parties together, is probably the most important work that you do, because it's helping with using questions to help people explore what's going on for the other person, what's going on for me, what am I feeling, what assumptions am I making, what do I really want, what could I live with. So there's a whole lot of other work. And I have done additional training in conflict coaching, which is, again, another tool which very much is about preparing people for conflict so that they understand that a lot of our response to situations and stress is this emotional reaction, and that when you unpack it and you start thinking about, well, what are my assumptions in this moment and what are the other person's assumptions, and all of, and you this backwards and forwards, and then you go, actually, there's not a lot here really. It's just we're reacting a lot. But if we were to stop reacting and we could hear each other, then we could probably work something out.
So do you find that most people respond really well to that? And when another question on top of that, just to load that up, is that when you go in to an organisation or you go into a conflict, those people you speak to separately before you begin the conversation? So this is the whole process that you do before you start a conversation and bring them together. You've had a whole conversation with each of them around assumptions and where they're coming from and what's stressing them.
Absolutely. And I think in a workplace, it's more than that, because in a workplace, there can be conflict between two or more people. But what we're really seeing is often an issue that's come to a head, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the main problem. What it's telling me is that there's probably some other things going on, and I want to understand what's really triggering this conflict. And it's usually not a personality dispute, as much as we'd like it to be. It's usually a whole lot more than that. And that's why I work with leaders and teams, so that we can hear everybody's voice. Because if we just look at the two parties who might be in conflict, chances are that they will recognise when you bring them into a mediation that there's a lot more at play here. And they usually unite against the leader or something else because they go, see, all this is happening and it's their fault. And it's like, so how do we stop the blame game? Well, let's not play it. So I don't do that. I usually talk to everybody in the team first, the leader and all of the team members. What's working well? What's not working well? What are the challenges? And I get a really good sense of what some of the issues are. And then I work with the leader around how they might unintentionally be contributing to this issue. And that can happen for a whole range of pretty basic things, like just a lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities, or a lack of clear vision, or a perception of favoritism, or something really not that big a deal, which can be fixed quite easily, but can have really significant effects. And then we work with the team to work out, well, what would good look like? And if everybody has a say in that, then they have some ownership of that as well, and some accountability towards that going forward. So I'm much more interested in what do people want rather than who's responsible for my feeling bad. Because if we stay in that feeling bad stuff, then we're still in the blame. You made me feel that way. Well, nobody can make you feel anything. We have to take some responsibility for our response to various situations. But what we can do is we can take some responsibility for what it looks like going forward. And that's a much healthier place to be.
And so with that whole team, they get together with the manager or the leader of that, and they just have then a general discussion. So the manager knows all about what's happening for those team members. And do they know what's happening for the manager, or does that all come together when it's...
Well, we explore that. So I can say, and it's often it is so often so clear that the team members know that the leader is stressed, is under all this pressure, might be scared because there's a big project coming along or whatever is going on. So they often have quite a lot of insight. But because there's often a lack of vulnerability around what the leader is actually experiencing, that it's sort of like, well, you're not sharing this with us, and now you're wanting us to wear the fallout. And it's like, well, how about we just all acknowledge it, and then we can move on from there and resolve issues. So it doesn't have to be like, there are some conflicts which just don't resolve because people hold on to their position, and that's what that is. But it really is enormously assisted in workplaces if leaders take some responsibility and accountability for whatever's going on in the team, own it, and then it's so much easier to resolve it because everybody's looking at the leader, come what may. Yeah.
And to tell the truth, assumption is just a huge thing, isn't it? Like, just assuming. I was just listening to someone the other day talking about their workplace and the assumptions that have been made about all of the staff, their skill levels, assuming what they know, and they come into the party and there was a whole lot of knowledge that wasn't even there around the people when they were employed. So they've kind of employed the wrong people and put them into roles, assuming so much. And like you say, we assume every day as people. We're always making assumptions, like every moment that we're looking at something, there's an assumption sitting in there, isn't there?
Absolutely.
So what do you say to people about assumptions? Because I talk about assumptions with people all the time as well. But then some people assume that that what I'm saying is rubbish. So, you don't know, but so what do you tell people to think when they assume something?
I encourage people to think in questions instead of thinking in statements. And so my line is that if you're thinking in statements, then you're thinking in a judgment mode. You've already made some decisions. So you're making assumptions, you've made some judgments based on past behaviour or whatever, and it's usually wrong. And an example? Well, it can be really easy. Like somebody... So you can have some really poor behaviour. So you can see some poor behaviour and you can make an assumption that person doesn't want to be there. All right, so they're late for work or they're kicking the door, basically they're complaining or whatever, and you can easily make an assumption they don't want to be there. But if you have a curious mindset and you go to that person and you say, can we talk about what's going on for you? Because I'm making some assumptions at the moment that you don't want to be here because this is what I'm seeing. But I'm not sure if that's right. Can we talk about what's going on for you? And give that person then an opportunity to tell you what's going on for them. Because it might be that they're feeling frustrated or bored, or there's something else going on in their personal life that's really important that's distracting them. Like, there could be so many things. But we can so very easily just write off a person on the basis of some behaviour that we've seen that we don't like. And then the confirmation bias sets in and we've just decided, right, this person is not engaged in this workplace. They don't want to be here. And the evidence for this is, bang, that they're late all the time or that they don't participate in meetings. When in fact, we don't know because we're not in their heads, because we don't. We really don't know. And if we go to that person with kindness, just like we would like other people to come to us with kindness and just say, help me understand what's going on for you right now, because this is what I'm seeing and I'm not sure what's triggering this behaviour. And you can be really gentle with it. And so conflict doesn't have to be loud and toxic and mean, but there's still a conflict. The conflict is the thought process that's going on in someone's head who's made the assumptions that this other person doesn't want to be there. And so they're thinking it and they're looking for behaviour that then confirms it. So there's a conflict there, but it's not actually out in the public until such time as that person says something. And it might. And so what often happens is we tolerate, because we don't like conflict, so we don't call out the behaviour that we're seeing that we don't like. So the person is late and disengaged for a long period of time. And then we've built up this whole narrative in our head as to the reason why that's happening. And then something's going to happen one day and it's going to blow. They'll be really late, or they'll say something inappropriate in a meeting, and it's like, right, I've had enough, and now it's really difficult. So why not just ask a question early rather than let it build into something that's bigger than it doesn't need to be?
And that is a perfect example, because it's really true. We've had that in our place of work, and we've spoken about curiosity as well with one of your fellow organisers, people in your organisation, and it changed our staff's headset instantly, because nobody ever thinks about that. Usually you get to that place of explosion, and that's what's scary for everyone, isn't it? Like, most of us just go, oh my goodness, I don't want to touch this. I'm going to stay away from it. I don't want it, because most people say to me, no matter who they are, no matter what personality they have, I don't like conflict. And I'm like, well, no one does. Like, seriously, nobody really wants to explode or yell or scream or get out of control and with somebody else. And when you do go in with that kindness, but you see, the thing is, Kate, is that not many people know about that, and not many people have got those skills taught them, because we just, who says to us at school, hey guys, this is how you handle conflict? Like, wouldn't it be great if it was part of the curriculum?
It would be fabulous. And it would make us more empathetic.
Oh, absolutely.
It would help enormously.
And the assumption thing too, like all the young children at school, like all of the teenagers who are making automatic assumptions about other people, especially with Instagram around these days and things like that, assumptions of other people's wealth, of how they organise their day, of how they do things, without even knowing the truth behind everything. And
absolutely
questioning it.
Absolutely.
Is that a true world? Is that a true person?
Well, we have a media that feeds that. So it's everything's a headline. It's a judgment. We've already decided. There's a lack of curiosity, really, and I think social media and media feed that all the time, and we just get told what we want to hear. And yet, if you think that people are good, even you don't have to like them all, but if you actually think that people are doing their best and they're coming from a position of good rather than an attempt to cause harm, then suddenly that changes it. And it's sort of like, and so you can actually disagree with caring. You don't have to agree, but if I don't agree with you about something that I feel really passionately about, that's fine, because we can then have a really interesting conversation about, well, what is it? What's happened in your life that you hold on to that, and vice versa? Because that's a really interesting conversation to have.
That some people would struggle with that too.
Oh, lots of people would struggle with that. Lots of people would struggle with that. It's
really great for us to sit here and talk about this like that. But it is very true, because people do come from different headsets as well. And, we'll talk about that when we talk in our next episode about profiling and temperaments and people coming together, because I know that some people I know, no matter whether I talk about in this manner and talk about questioning behaviours and going in, they go, well, why? Why would you do that? Like there's there's a really different headset. But I do think that it's a wonderful thing for anybody listening, and particularly anybody in a leadership role, to actually think about the judgments and the assumptions that they're making of the people who are working with them, and go in with your questions, like go in with even, I've noticed that you're feeling a bit flat at the moment. Is there anything you want to share with me? Is there any way I can help you? Because that is no matter who you are, someone caring about you and communicating with you is huge. And then, but some people emotionally aren't ready for the can of worms that comes out of that as well, which is sometimes...
I get that, but I think you don't actually have to take that all on. You don't have to, as a leader, you don't have to take that on. All you can do is ask the question, how can I support you with this? It's not yours to take on. It's that person's responsibility to manage whatever's going on for them. And if you're really clear about those boundaries around, okay, this is what you're going, so what do you need from me right now, and how can I support you? And you need to, as leaders, we also have a responsibility to ensure that the rest of our team is safe. So if there's a can of worms, we need to think about how big is that can of worms. But in the main, most of the time, you will get enough information around just, I'm feeling stressed at the moment because of this, or I'm feeling bored and I would like more challenges and that's why I'm disengaged, or whatever it is. And then suddenly you've had a conversation and the world changes. The world suddenly looks a lot different, and you know what you're working with. If you've got some information, you can actually deal with that. Whereas while it's still an assumption and a thought bubble in your head, which is usually wrong, you might be actually contributing to the problem and making it worse. And you don't mean to, but it's just because we haven't got all the information on the table. And so it's about developing those skills of empathy and care and compassion and not making assumptions, but then also having some boundaries around those conversations as well. So we don't have to be emotionally responsible for other people's pain or for whatever's going on for them. But if we know about it, then we can be much more aware of how we can support that person, or what we need to do to help manage the rest of the team while this person's going through whatever they're going through.
That's very true. So can you give me just 3 top tips for being, working with people and understanding other people in your workplace and avoiding conflict?
Well, I think just being really mindful of, am I thinking in statements or questions? Like, I would just ask the question, just why? Go with a why? Why is that happening? Because if we think in questions, then it's much easier to have empathy. If we think in statements, it's much harder to be empathetic. So empathy is your friend. So do that. I think working with people too is to care about people, is to listen. And listening is not just about hearing people, but it's giving somebody the time and space to talk to you. So whether or not that means going for a walk or going for a coffee, but it doesn't mean looking at your phone while you're sitting at dinner, like it's truly being engaged. So, and again, if you are listening and with curiosity, then you're asking questions and then you're truly demonstrating that you're listening. So listening is incredibly powerful. And then the third one is just to constantly think about how can we reduce stress. So whether that's your personal stress or team stress, and that's where self-care is so important. So looking after self and looking after the team, like what's triggering this conflict is usually some stress somewhere in the system. What can we do to reduce stress? And usually it's taking action. You take some action to reduce the stress. So that might be having a conversation, but it might be going home and having a sleep because you're exhausted, and you just will perform better if you have rested. It's a self-care.
Thank you for those wonderful, wise words. And honestly, anybody listening, Kate is amazing at what she does. And we'll have all of her details in the show notes. Thanks again, Kate. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are going to get a huge amount out of what you've just said.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate.
Pleasure. If we reframe conflict as a part of human interaction, as a sign that actually someone's not being heard, as an opportunity to build a relationship rather than something that needs to be fixed, we might manage conflict better. We might build stronger relationships and make more positive progress. If you're thinking that the source of the conflict is all about the other person, I hate to tell you this, but there's a good chance that you're part of the problem. Have a think about the times when you experience conflict. What part did you have to play in that? And most importantly, what will you do about it now you've listened today? Just try and start with putting aside your assumption and judgment of others, asking curious questions, and listening. Thank you for listening to Parenting and Personalities. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could leave a rating and a review that would help others learn about this podcast. If you're interested in discovering more about you and your family's personality types, you'll find my book, Who Is This Monster or Treasure in My House, on Booktopia or Amazon. If you have an episode idea, please send a note to thepersonalitycoach@gmail.com. Many thanks to our producers at Stories and Strategies, and we'll see you next time.